Appreciate it. Really excited to be here with all of you today and speak about modern API development and the tools, resources, and processes that are needed to be able to support that. So a little bit about myself. My name is Alex Walling. I'm RapidAPI's field CTO, so really focused on getting out in the field like we are today and meeting with customers and prospects. Been with the company for about 5 years, so know a lot of the ins and outs about the strategy and how we actually got to where we are today. So if you're interested in connecting, alex@rapidapi.com. Would love to connect with you and speak more about API strategy. So what am I going to cover today? First, I'm going to look at kind of why APIs. Why are we here at this conference for 2 days? And all industries are focused on this topic of driving innovation via APIs. Then I'm going to look into how APIs ecosystems are becoming more complex and ultimately the tools and strategies to be able to support that complex ecosystem. And I'll leave a couple of minutes towards the tail end for us to do a little bit of a Q&A if there's any interest. So why APIs? There's a lot of reasons that APIs have become so important to all industries. The one that I'm going to look at today is what we call the developer gap. So if we start looking at this graph, I'm going to bring in some data. I'm a math nerd myself. And we look at the VC investment, or in fact, the investment into digital transformation. You see this huge increase in spending to be able to drive companies to digital innovation. Very buzzwords, I apologize, but it's the best way to describe what's going on here. But then we look at the number of developers in industry to be able to support this type of innovation, and you see a real lagging factor to that. We don't have enough developers to really support this innovation. And so this is what we call the developer gap. And I'm going to look into how APIs are going to be better suited to help bridge this gap through reuse of services and driving further collaboration through APIs. And this is only compounded with the Great Resignation and so many developers considering or having left jobs. So this is a stat that we pulled from our recent developer survey that we run every year and found that 54% of developers are considering or have left their jobs. So this really just drives that need for quick adoption and usage of services. And so what does this all mean for organizations? Well, again, the gap between investments into innovation and the number of developers to support it only continues to grow. This requires that organizations use the developers they have as effectively as possible and drive that innovation through their existing services. And finally, as you're experiencing this developer turnover, you need to onboard and provide the right tools and resources to be able to support your developers. So next up, I'm going to look at how API ecosystems are becoming more complex. And really what we're looking at here is whether it's by nature of the organization and it maturing its API strategy, or just over time as new technologies and resources come into play, it's inherently making our API ecosystems more complex. And so in here, in kind of a simple API ecosystem, we look at a company with maybe tens of APIs, but in a complex ecosystem, you're going to have hundreds or thousands of APIs. Traditionally in the past, it's only been REST or SOAP, but now we're looking at GraphQL, webhooks, WebSockets, gRPC and RPC, Kafka, and we're evolving what the definition of an API is. Previously, it's going to be single cloud providers, data centers, things like that. And now we're looking at multi-cloud hybrid approaches, again, just expanding where these APIs are deployed. In the past, it might be 0 or 1 API gateways. Now we see companies, I talked to a company recently that had 20 different API gateways, different vendors deployed, all within their organization. In the past, it would be a single team building APIs, and now it's multiple different teams all collaborating and building their own resources, and you need to approach this and provide the resources and processes to support this complex ecosystem. So what does this modern developer stack look like? You need it to not only support REST and SOAP, but also the more non-traditional API types like GraphQL, async APIs, gRPC and RPC, and this is going to continue to evolve and get more complex. You're going to need to look at the integration from your client and as you test and build the API, all the way through to testing and monitoring and really looking at that full life cycle. and designing a full build process without having to utilize other tools, making sure it's a seamless integration between all the different steps a developer needs to take to build and deploy an API. And again, integrating with that existing tooling and ensuring visibility across the development lifecycle, across the different teams in the organization building these APIs. So at RapidAPI, we really look at two core personas. First is the API builder. These are the developers who are building, deploying, testing, monitoring, publishing their APIs, and then also the API consumers. So these are developers who are taking those assets and utilizing them in their applications. I'm going to focus a little bit more on this builder persona, but it's really important to think about across the entire API lifecycle how you're going to support these developers. So the first step in any great API is designing that API, taking really this product-first mentality and making sure that you're starting with that design. There's a lot of tools out there that are enabling developers to share and collaborate on these APIs, designing and mocking them. It's important to meet developers where they are with the tools and assets that they're already using. So one of the things we look at is what IDEs are companies using. Well, we found in the Stack Overflow survey that 70% of developers are using VS Code. So trying to find ways to bring this development into the VS Code, into those existing IDEs. Thinking about versioning as you go through this, it's going to need to be an iterative approach. The design you start with an API might not be the one you ultimately end up with as you continue to add functionality. And as always, collaboration is king. You've got a lot of great assets, and being able to combine these developers together is the most important thing to do. And this is confirmed as top of mind for enterprises, as 86% of large enterprises are starting to formalize an API design process. One of the newer, and in that, there's a lot of tools out there and a few different strategies or philosophies on how to actually design your API. Kind of looking at a client-based approach where you're really looking at the request-response model and building out that API spec as you're developing the API. Or more of a spec-first approach where it's pure design, typically more of a code-first approach, creating that open API specification. And one of the newer trends that we're seeing is what we're calling API spec linting. So not only being able to kind of test and validate functionality of the API, but also being able to enforce certain style guidelines and consistency across the APIs. Because ultimately building APIs that are consistent and easy to use is really difficult, even if you have experienced PMs and experienced engineering managers, because you get this real siloed team-based approach where they're not always talking about how should parameters be named, or what's the consistent authorization model we should be using. And so in this, API spec linting enables organizations to more broadly enforce the style guidelines and enforce documentation best practices across the APIs. Next up, we look at building and deploying an API. And this is going to fit into a very common deployment model that you've already seen, where a developer pushes their code out to GitHub. This will trigger a build process in whatever CI/CD tooling you're looking at. That will then go deploy the backends. It will publish the spec out to the gateway to ensure those are in sync, and then finally deploy out to something like an API hub to facilitate that collaboration. But once you deploy that API, it doesn't end there. It's really important to look at testing and monitoring these APIs, because ultimately API quality is the most important thing you have. These are production services that other customers, whether they be internal or external, are utilizing. And one issue with the API can cause a tremendous amount of issues with the end application. And because it has added value, this enables you to achieve real CI/CD flows, all automated, because you're testing that API and ensuring that it's working in the various different environments that you're deploying out to. And because it's easy, APIs are inherently built as great assets to be able to test, because they're programmatic interfaces, so you can simply build the test around the API, ensure the functionality is working, and then move on with your deployment. And there's a few different types of testing that we can look at. First is contract validation, so ensuring that the parameters that you're saying you're going to provide in the API are actually what are being provided. Next up is functional validation, so ensuring that that API, as you're making post requests or calling the database, it's working as expected. And then finally, performance validation, so looking at error rate, uptime, just making sure it's working as expected, because again, this is ultimately going to impact your end user applications. And this is continuing to be a top priority for developers. We saw last year 92% of all developers plan to test them, and this is up from the previous year's developer survey in 2020. And then finally, we've created this great asset. How are we going to reutilize and again drive that developer efficiency, which is really what we need as organizations today with the developer gap and with churn in organizations? So looking at publishing APIs, it's really important to define access. Not all developers, not all end user consumers should be able to utilize this API. So being able to set up that fine-grained access control and manage that API is really important. We want to make sure that we publish the full API. It's not just about API specs. It's not just about the API reference. It's about all that content that surrounds the API as well. Tutorials, how-to guides. How do we actually make developers effective with the functionality being provided? And then finally, make it self-serviceable. There is nothing worse than being a developer, wanting to use an API, and you have to go email some team member who lives on the other side of the country. They've already gone out of office for the day. It takes a week to get an API key provisioned. So making sure that this is published to something that enables you to use this in a self-service manner. So we looked at that API builder persona, some of the things that you need to be thinking about as you're defining the API building lifecycle. And now we're going to switch over to the consumer mentality. So we built this API, we've deployed it, it's great functionality. Now how do we actually drive usage of that API? So the first and most important thing is discovery. Creating one single spot for all of your developers to be able to go find the API reference, find the documentation, and start using it as quickly as possible, while bringing in all of the data and metadata that you have available to make more informed decisions about which APIs to use. Bringing in things like analytics. If an API isn't performing, I don't want to use it because it's not going to work for my application. Being able to bring in things like advanced filtering, knowing which team, environment it's deployed to, versioning, and just getting to documentation as quickly as possible. And by that, I mean the code of the documentation. So once I've found that API, how do I start using it? We call this time to 200. How quickly can I go from deciding I need an API to actually getting a successful 200 status code in that playground? It's really important to drive this and reduce that friction to seeing a successful working API call as quickly as possible. And give access to this API quickly as well. Whether it's production, I know that for a lot of the regulated industries is a big no-no, but it could also be a sandbox playground. It could be a mock response. But give that feeling of seeing a pseudo-production response so that the developer can see how the API is going to function in their application. And then finally, I've found the API. I've started figuring out what functionality, what data might be provided. Now I need to start integrating it. This is going to bring in code snippets, SDKs. I was speaking at the last API Days conference where Phil Nash from Twilio talked about documentation isn't documentation without code. I just loved that. I think it really resonated with me because I've heard so many times about the marketing landing pages or the content that we want to make it look beautiful. But at the end of the day, developers only care about the code and utilizing that functionality. They don't care how it looks. They don't care about any of that. They want to solve the problems they have. So make it easier for those developers to embed that APIs into their applications and extend that thinking about time to 200 into not just seeing a successful 200 status code in the playground, but actually seeing it in your application. And examples go a long way. This comes back to that it's not only about the API reference, but the tutorials, the documentation, examples are really needed to better support this. And then finally, monitor these APIs. Continue to make sure that they're performant and up. And this is not only from the builder's perspective, but as an API consumer, being able to see how is this API impacting my application? If I'm using 7 APIs in this application, well, how is that impacting the latency of my application? How is that impacting my user interface? So providing those analytics not only to the builders, but also the consumers, we're finding is very important for most organizations. So in summary, the next generation API developer stack, it's going to be thinking about the entire flow from builder to consumer, making sure that you get the tools that developers want to be using to better support their efficiency. Optimize for openness, because developers are always going to be picky about which tools they want to use. So having an open platform is going to enable you to rotate out tools as needed and support the different development workflows. Ensure that you're supporting multiple different types of APIs, not just REST and SOAP, but GraphQL, Async, Kafka, all of those. Be environment agnostic. Developers don't actually care where the backend API is being deployed. They just want to use that functionality so that they can solve the problem they have. And then finally, keep development tools separate from runtime components. We find this is really important to have the best-in-class developer tooling, not just a packaged bundle of everything under the sun. And with this, the one plug, the little marketing plug I'll have, is today we've actually launched RapidAPI Studio that helps solve some of these problems. So we're launching a designer to be able to build and define your APIs, a testing suite to be able to utilize that request generator and actually generate complex, comprehensive workflows via the request response workflow. And then finally, we've actually launched a VS Code extension to actually bring all this functionality, again, right into the developer's workflow experience. Right in VS Code is what I use all day, every day. So I'm personally very selfishly excited about this. And if you're interested in learning more, I created a little bit.ly link, just bit.ly.com/rapidapi-studio. As well as I'll be around the conference for the rest of this time. And if anyone has any questions, please don't hesitate to come find me. Or my email's, again, just alex@rapidapi.com. So thank you so much. I've got a little bit of time for Q&A if anyone has any questions, and really appreciate the time.
I'm going to just make a couple of comments.
Yeah, please.
Great session. There are two parts that hit me about what you were saying, one on the builder side and one on the consumer side.
Yeah.
You know, I've done a lot. So we're in the track now on API stack and governance, and so this is, you know, the very appropriate topic for that. And on the build side, just the flow that you went through there from a governance perspective, and one of the things that I've always said to people, companies I've spoken to, is governance should make it easy to do things the right way and hard to do things the wrong way.
Yep.
And so, you know, if you're just making it hard for everybody to do everything, that's bureaucracy, and that's no good, right? So the idea of flowing through that cycle is, you know, very important.
Couldn't agree more. I think it's really important to think about this as far as a developer shouldn't be frustrated through that workflow. Again, I forget exactly what the wording was, but it should enable developers to do the right things as effectively as possible and
down that path.
Stop them from doing the wrong things. I really like that.
Yeah, and the second side, the evaluate, just hit a hot button for me as well. I was asked to judge an API contest. And so I was pointed at the APIs. I didn't have to go discover them, right? Yep. I was pointed to them, and they made it so hard to evaluate the APIs. I had to install things. I had to, you know, go get other tools. I mean,
pull up your terminal, type in a janky request
people
curl.
will not spend that amount of time if they have a choice. You know, so one of the statistics I heard early in my API life was people will spend 30 seconds looking at your API, and if they can't figure out whether it's going to help them or not, they're moving on.
Yeah.
And so you want to think about this from that consumer perspective and make sure that they can have an easy time to evaluate the API and see that it's going to do what they need it to do. Yeah. So that's my soapbox.
I love it. No, I appreciate it. Great points.
Any other questions from anybody? We do have a few minutes, I think, before for the next session. Yep.
So you mentioned we can design the APIs in the RapidAPI Studio now.
Yeah.
What's the level of services provided to developers in terms of generating code? So on the both sides, producer and consumer, and follow up right away. What frameworks are used for that?
Yeah.
What libraries are used for that? Because there is such a wide variety of those.
100%.
Yeah, so that's...
Yeah, really great question. So on the builder side, we're really more focused on the definition of the API. We're not necessarily generating back-end code for the API based on the design of that. That's just not kind of where we're playing today. For the consumer side, based on what's been defined, we're really focused around utilizing OpenAPI spec as a standard. We've extended it a little bit through their extensions capability, but we're definitely conforming to those standards. And based on that, in RapidAPI's hub, we're able to generate code snippets. And so from there, I believe we've got 13 different languages supported and a couple different request libraries in each of those. Not necessarily proprietary SDKs or anything like that. We're keeping, again, this idea of the open platform and wanting to use some of those open source tools that developers are already using. So for me, I'm an NPM Node developer, so I use Axios, and we support Axios.
So client side and server side.
Exactly, yep.
All right, any other questions before we wrap it up? All right, thanks, Alex. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.